Now, our next speaker is Jim Walsh, and the title of his talk is The Sack of Balbriggan, September 1920. Jim was born in 1948. He attended Balrothery National School and Skerries de la Salle College. He served as librarian with Dublin City and County Library Services from 1966 to 2010. He completed a thesis on printed sources relating to North County Dublin and was awarded a fellowship of the Library Association of Ireland in 1979. He was a co-founder of our society in July '81, a dear friend of the society. His passion for and in-depth knowledge of local history is legendary. And I suppose the personal note that I would say is, for the information about Balbriggan, Jim Walsh is Mr. Balbriggan.
Thank you, Brian, for that very gracious introduction. At the outset, before we begin our illustrated narrative of the events, as we understand them, that led to the notorious reprisal called the Sack of Balbriggan. First of all, I'd like to thank the Committee of Balbriggan District Historical Society for encouraging me in my research over the last 2 years. And in particular, I wish to thank our current Secretary, Killian Harford, because all of the images we're about to see were prepared by Killian. So we're ready to begin with our first image. The item on the left-hand side is the cover of a book called The Atlas of the Irish Revolution, published by Cork University Press, 2017. It was actually reviewed by Michael Foley on the 17th of December of the same year for the Sunday Times, and he called it a monumental tome, and he's quite correct. It contains 158 articles by 103 contributors, over 900 pages in text. And there are 8 specific references in the index to the Sack of Balbriggan. It's probably the best €59 I ever spent. And the second item is the third in a trilogy of 3 books by Michael B. Barry. This is The Fight for Irish Freedom, an illustrated history of the War of Independence. And Killian and I have selected several illustrations from both publications. Next, we turn to 3 items I found of considerable use and would suggest that for any further researchers, they would also tap into them. The item on the left is the cover of a book written by Richard Bennett in 1959 called A Black and Tans. For many years, it was the only book written on the subject, and on rereading it, it was much more comprehensive than I remembered. Mind you, it only devotes about a page and a half to the Sack of Balbriggan with one photograph. And lucky enough for us, it was reprinted in 1995 by Barnes & Noble in New York. The middle item is the front cover of a book by Stamullen native Brendan Matthews, community historian. And some years ago, he came into possession of a tranche of, invoices belonging to a family called Mitchell for 1920. They all relate to something they had bought from a trader around Balbriggan. For example, this is an item bought from Joe Costello by the Mitchell family. And they illustrated the book. Now, it's a small book that is such by Brendan. But I found the first few chapters very, very good as an introduction to the social history of Balbriggan, because for years Brendan was involved in Millmount Museum in Drogheda on an indexing project at Drogheda Independent, which goes back to 1884, and he found an awful lot of interesting articles about Balbriggan from January 1920 onwards. The third item was published in 2017 by Brian Galler called Pawns, Ireland, the War of Independence. It's actually a book intended for teenagers or young adults. But on reading it, I would recommend it to adults of all ages. It's marvellously well written, and it's set in Balbriggan in 1920. And for the record, the story concerns Johnny Dunn, an orphan. And he gets a job as a boot boy in the hotel called the Mill Hotel, which I take is based on the original Hamilton Arms Hotel in Balbriggan, which in 1920 was owned by Charles and Mary Graham. And Johnny befriends 2 girls through his membership of the local band. And one is Alice Goodwin, the daughter of the widowed owner of the hotel, and the other girl is Stella Radcliffe, the daughter of the newly arrived OC of Gormanstown Aerodrome. But in the book, he comes under the influence of a visiting whiskey salesman called O'Shea, who inveigles him into listening in to conversations at the course of his work in the hotel, particularly involving officers from the aerodrome, because the volunteers are very interested in the government plans for the aerodrome. As we know now, in August of 1920, in fact, The Black and Tans and auxiliaries were moved to Gormanstown from the Phoenix Park, and as Ross O'Mahony stated in an article, it was an ideal base for training and raiding. The item on the left is the front cover of a video, and it was put together by Tommy Coughlin and his daughter Elaine and I in the early 90s. And Tommy had completed a 50-minute film on video for ALSA, of which he was a social member. When I saw the finished product, I thought, what if we could source 3 individuals or more in Balbriggan who were alive in September 1920? So we sourced Michael Hammond, who was born and reared in Clonard Street, then living in Lawless Terrace, and also Miss McGillivray, who was then living in Drogheda Street, but originally she was a Keegan from Dublin Street. And as I said earlier, we actually traced, and this is Bridget Daly from Flemington Lane. So we visit each person for an hour. I'm on camera for a few moments, Tommy is manipulating the camera, and Elaine, at the age of 14, stood to the side with a handheld microphone. Tommy edited each interview into 15 minutes. Now we had an hour-long video, and we got a phone call from Maxine McAvoy of the X of the Strangers. And he rang me once and asked me to leave some material in the Milestone Inn, where he had a forthcoming gig, which I did in a big brown envelope, and he later recorded a ballad he penned on the Sack of Balbriggan. And as the credits roll, his song rolls out. So, Jerry MacDonald, a committee member then, current trustee, had the sound enhanced. Tommy devised the cover, and we ended up selling about 300 copies for about a tenner at the time. But gradually the sound began to deteriorate, and we ceased selling them as such. I think the last time we used it as part of our autumn programme was the very year this hotel opened, the Bracken Court Hotel, and we used the facilities of a pull-down screen as of this morning. A very large crowd turned up, including members of the Daly family. And as Mrs. Daly sang her song about the Ballad of Balbriggan, she got a round of applause as if she was in the room. At that stage, all 3 interviewees had passed on. So as much as anything, that is a tribute to the courtesy and the reminiscence of those 3 individuals. Later on, a committee viewed the CD version of this, but we felt really, with so much new material available to us now, that perhaps it deserves a brand new, perhaps production, maybe by professionals, with a brand new script as such. The item on the right is a title page from a thesis, and it was actually compiled by local lady Mary Fogarty in 2010. And she was studying at Dublin University, and I helped her with some sources then, so she presented me with a personal copy. And having read it several times, it's a very good introduction to Balbriggan at the beginning, but she's maybe one of the first people to avail of the newly released contents of the Military History Bureau. Between 1947 and 1957, people went around the country interviewing people who had been involved in the War of Independence and the Irish Civil War, about 1,900 people. And they were under lock and key and weren't released until March 2003. She made copious use of these recently released articles or statements, one by Thomas Peppard from Lusk, intelligence officer with the Fimgar Brigade, but of particular significance and relevant to us in Balbriggan, the statement of Jack Gaynor, recorded in 1955. And his story is a story unto itself. It doesn't relate specifically to the Sack of Balbriggan, but to an earlier event in April of that year. He was the first captain of Balbriggan Company of Volunteers, formed in 1917. But in particular is the statement of Michael Rock, and we'll come to that later. 2 items recently converted slides by Killian. The item on the left is the cover of a novel published in 1989 by Hugh Fitzgerald Ryan from Skerries, ex-teacher, artist, etc. He wrote 3 books altogether. I had an opportunity of recently reading the 2 chapters relevant to the sack. It's fictional, but it's extremely gruesome and extremely real, and I would recommend anybody who wants to real understanding of what may have happened to both James Lawless and John Gibbons in the night to read it. The item on the right, to me, to my humble opinion, is probably the most important book that you can read in terms of the Sack of Balbriggan. It was published in 2010. edited by Professor David Fitzpatrick, a Trinity History Workshop. But two chapters in particular are indispensable. Chapter 5 by Ross O'Mahony, it's called The Sack of Balbriggan, Tit-for-Tat Terror in North County Dublin. It's probably the most concise account in print yet. The Sack of Balbriggan, there are one or two minor errors, but then that's natural. But chapter 6 is very special. It was contributed by David Fitzpatrick itself. It's called The Cost of Balbriggan. And in that article, extensive research, he traced the history and the culmination of 74 claims lodged by 71 claimants in Balbriggan. And he eventually, and one of our images will be taken from his book, will itemise many of the sums of compensation received by the various people in Balbriggan. This is a street map of Balbriggan, and we've taken this from an article in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution by Marie Coleman, a historian attached to Queen's University Belfast. And we start here with Smith's Public House. The building still stands. It was then owned by Mary Smith, and she had a shop and a bar. And we start with the events on the Monday, the 20th September 1920. There are various conflicting accounts of what happened, but the general tenor is that around about 8 o'clock that night, a car arrives in Dublin. These two men alight. They were both brothers. They were both from Denimady in Galway. They were both officers in the Royal Irish Academy. The younger brother was Peter. He was in his early 30s, head constable, recently promoted to district inspector. The older brother was William Patrick, a sergeant in charge of weights and measures. Now, it was said they were celebrating Peter's promotion, and they were intent on travelling out to Gormanstown military camp, where Black and Tans and auxiliaries from August of that year were then based. Something happened later on to occasion Mary Smith to refuse to serve any more drink. She sent word down to the RSC barracks, just a few hundred yards down the road on Bridge Street. Personnel came up, for whatever reason, they took one look and declined to intervene and retreated to their barracks. At this very moment, further up the street, Connolly's public house, Pat Connolly, on the confluence of Mill Street and Bridge Street, a number of local and prominent volunteers were drinking. They included Michael Rock from the Knoll, who at that stage was OC of the Knoll Battalion, which is an overall control of the various local companies in North Fingal. Willie Corcoran, a local man, who was then living in Clonard Street. He was 22 years of age, second lieutenant by his own admission of the volunteers, living with 6 siblings and his mother and Annie Corcoran, who also had a dairy. And the third man was Michael James Durham, or Jimmy Durham, and he was the son of John Durham, who had a house and premises and a pub across the road. Now, in January of 1920, John Durham and his son Jimmy were both elected to Balbriggan Town Commissioners on behalf of Sinn Féin, as was James McGlew, the owner of this particular pub here. From reading Michael Rock's statement as recorded in April of 1956, when he was 7 years of age, he said the only reason he was in Balbriggan that night was that some weeks earlier he'd organised what he called a flapper athletics meeting in the field in Gormanstown, quite close to the railway station and to the camp. Ostensibly, it was to raise funds for the cause, but he couldn't advertise it as such. He remarks ironically that most of the contestants were actually Tans from the nearby camp, and he said he was in Balbriggan that particular night to pay expenses to Jimmy Durham, who acted as treasurer on that particular occasion. Now, I was very, very lucky. In 1978, before the formation of the Historical Society here, I visited the home of Mrs. Delahan in Clonard Street, where Willie Corcoran was then living, and I taped his reminiscence over about a 20-minute period. And we're now, I suppose, very lucky to be able to compare and contrast his commentary when he was almost 80 years of age with Michael Rock's commentary of 1956. And to quote Willie Corcoran, he said, "I was drinking at Michael Rock's, or Pat Connolly's and Michael Rock, my apologies, when Jack Kildare and John Thompson come into the pub and said, and I quote, 'There's murder up in the bar.' There were his exact wordings. He was recording to whatever was happening up in Mary Smith's bar. He told Michael Rock he knew where to find 2 weapons. He was sent up to Clonard Street, where he located his hidden weapons in a hayrick, returned to Connolly's, gave 1 weapon to Michael Rock, and they decided to advance up the street and up what Willie Corcoran called Heaney's Lane, but we know as Vauxhall Street. And I will now use this opportunity to quote directly for a few moments from Michael Rock's statement as to what exactly happened on the night in question. Quote, "We went to the back of the public house," that was Willie Corcoran himself, "where the tans were, and with guns in our hands entered and ordered them to clear out. Amongst a party of tans who were seemingly unarmed, but who we knew always carried some type of small arms, were 2 head constables, 2 brothers named Burke from Kerry," end of quote. Now we know, of course, he was incorrect to a certain extent. They were 2 brothers from Lenamaddy, not from Kerry, and one, of course, was head constable. Continuing, quote again, "As we entered, we could see the tans had hold of a man named Monks. I think it was a man called Patrick Monks from Clonard Street, and some other civilians who had been drinking in the pub. When I ordered them to clear out, instead of doing so, they made a rush at me, and I had no option but to fire. I shot one of the head constables dead and wounded the other, who later recovered, and my pal and I, as he worded it, cleared out the back door and got safely away." Now, it's obviously, from the rest of the statement, obviously apparent that they weren't necessarily expecting a reprisal, because some months earlier, Sergeant Patrick Finnerty had been shot in somewhat similar manner when coming down from Clonard Hill, having followed a parade which had been organised on the 13th of April to celebrate the release of hunger strikers from Mountjoy Prison. And we know from Jack Gaynor's statement in 1955 that he was actually the man who shot Sergeant Finnerty. Now, some houses were raided, but nobody was charged. And that's why the 2 men didn't necessarily immediately run for cover. According to Willie Corcoran, they walked up Dublin Street, up Market Lane, and then actually down Pump Lane. And if they met anybody they thought was involved, they told them maybe to be careful. Now, Michael Rock says the tans came back in force to Balbriggan that night and looted and burnt the town. They burned some 30 houses, including a woolen factory. They took out Lawless and Gibbons, who had remained in their homes, and shot the 2 dead. He said an ex-British Army officer or soldier who went by the name of Jack Straw, which was not his real name, guided the tans around the town and pointed out to them the houses to burn. Straw was not a native of the area. He was subsequently arrested by us for the party played that night, and he was duly executed. Dr Fulham of Balbriggan was able to sway the tans from burning several other houses in the town. The British learned that I was the principal person concerned in the shooting affair in the public house, and they searched for me far and wide. I was now truly on the run. To continue our narrative now, at about 12 o'clock that evening, Drogheda Independent reported that about 3 to 4 Crossley tenders arrived in Bridge Street and parked outside the barracks. That a sergeant in the RIC was then seen commandeering cans of petrol from Connolly's garage on Key Street and taken away on a handcart, proceeding over to Durham's public house, I suppose terrorising the family, evicting them, and burning the entire premises. The family were taken away to safety, but John Durham was made to sit for several hours on the curbside, subjected to a brutal interrogation and threatened with death. We know that because several days after the sack of Balbriggan, a letter arrived from America addressed to the chairperson of the town commissioners, inviting him to attend meetings that were convened in America. John Durham at that stage wrote back and said his son, who was chairperson, was now in prison. But we know that 6 weeks later, after obtaining a visa, John Durham made it to America in what was described as a small trading vessel, gave verbatim evidence before the commission, which is shortly afterwards published in a leaflet called Torture and Terror in Ireland. So we know exactly what happened to him and his family on the night. It's a valuable document to have. Now, Connolly's house, shop and premises were totally burnt down as well. The Crown Forces then advanced up Clonard Street. Now, it was said that local people saw this man, Jack Straw, pointing at houses of known Republicans, particularly in Clonard Street, that apparently at some stage local people called it Sinn Féin Alley or Sinn Féin Row. They certainly burned down the house in Derry of Annie Corcoran, the widowed mother of Willie Corcoran. They burnt at least 20 thatched dwellings, 6 which belonged to James and Terence O'Neill, and 6 built by the Rural District Council. So at least 12 families, possibly large families, were all without a house and home the very next morning. As this was happening, of course, throughout the night, then they were shooting in the air and yelling and breaking in window panes and shooting. Many people in their night attire, men, women and children, fled up to Clonard Hill and to neighbouring fields and ditches for shelter and didn't venture down until the next morning. Now, further up Bridge Street leading into Drogheda Street, James McLuhan's shop was damaged but not his pub. There are 2 minor errors that we've noticed in this particular diagram. McLuhan was misspelled Madeleine, and back in the earlier description, Marie Coleman states that the Burke brothers were both killed by Michael Rock, and this error for some reason is still appearing in modern publications. And we know, of course, that William Patrick survived his serious wounds. Opposite James McLuhan's was Mary Ann Hall's shop, originally from Cavan, and Anastasia Morrissey, her public house, and she was in Tipperary. Further up now, we're approaching the junction of Railway Street, obviously leading to the railway station opened in 1852. The railway came through in 1844. The street was originally called Freeman's Row. Now, apparently they were marching down at some stage in the night, possibly to damage the most important factory of Balbriggan then, Smith's factory. At this stage, Balbriggan wasn't the first town to suffer from such a reprisal and not the last. But the Crown Forces were in the habit of inflicting major damage on the local economies of towns, so they went and burnt creameries and dairies. However, we have a remarkable document. It's the result of an interview given by a lady called Lily Collins, and it appeared in a folk book magazine in September 1971. It's a photograph of her, and she had passed away. And she said at 4 o'clock in the morning, she and her father, now her father was a man called J.J. Collins, figures previously in Balbriggan at the time. He was a senior employee in Smith's factory, in charge of a Balbriggan brass and reed band, in charge of their fire tender. And she expressed in her article the amazement of her father and herself, that as they heard the tramp of the soldiers' boots coming down the street, they heard Mr. Richard Gorman from next door going out with his son and remonstrating with the officers, and to her father's amazement, the officer listened. They left Smith's factory unscathed and proceeded down the sea banks, where ironically they burned to the ground a very large hosiery factory built in 1884 called Balbriggan Seamen's Limited and owned by an English firm, Deeds Templar and Company. They stated that between men directly employed in the factory and mothers and children throughout the town, they employed 400 people. And finally, we go back up Drogheda Street and we have 2 public premises or public licensed premises, John Landy's thatched premises and Joseph and Theresa McGowan's pub. They're listed as a grocery, but in fact there was a large house and pub as such. They were burnt to the ground, and of course the original name was the Gladstone Inn. So that's what happened on the night. During the night, several people were taken in for interrogation, but among whom were James Lawless, and we see the caption further down here, opposite the Hamilton Arms Hotel. He was then age 41. He and his wife, Mary Ann, had 8 young children, and he was involved with the volunteers, and he was taken out of his house that night, as was John Gibbons, a 27-year-old bachelor dairy farmer, then living in Hampton Street. He was secretary to the local volunteers. So they knew who they were looking for, and at dawn, unfortunately, the next morning, the bodies were found at dawn on the corner of Keith Street, much mutilated, and their bodies were taken by local people across the road to Keeling's Yard. And this is a recent photograph taken by Killian of the original building which housed the premises of Mary Smith's Bar. And this is the route up what Willie Corcoran called Heaney's Lane, but we call Vauxhall Street. And down on the left-hand side here, we can see it's midway. It's the original back door, wherein the two lads gain entry. The same back door is still standing in the premises to this day. And a shot just taken, probably in a very quiet Sunday morning by Killian, showing the streetscape of Bridge Street, because everything happened within several hundred yards. The John Barber shop here, and also recently the sign is gone, it's a hoarding up. And that was the original premises of James Lawless and his 8 children. He worked and lived there. This is the modern site. It's called Hampton Court in Hampton Street, but this was the original site where John Gibbons lived with his elderly mother and several unmarried sisters. And further down the road is the former YMCA building, probably the highest building of its type in Balbriggan. I think it was built in the 1870s, but in the 1920s it was leased to the RIC. And this is where the barracks were located, and it was up these steps where unfortunately James Lawless and John Gibbons are taken in for interrogation. Several of the sources relate that they might have been somewhat safe while in the custody of the local RIC, but then when they were entrusted by the District Inspector Hunter into the hands of the Black and Tans, their fate was sealed. And on the corner here of Keith Street and Bridge Street is where the 2 bodies were actually found. Now, directly across the road was the location of Keeling's yard, and the house was a modern house built by Joe Keeling, one of the sons of Christopher Keeling. Now, we're indebted to Mrs. Keeling of Chapel Street, who recently donated this photograph to Killian. And I take it was taken within 10, 12, 15 years of the Sack of Balbriggan, and it shows Mrs. Bridget Keeling standing. No, the shop was actually in her name. And we know that the 2 boys standing in front of her were Joe Keeling and William Keeling. Bill Keeling, in later life when he retired, became a very good friend and patron of our society. We've taken this illustration from Michael Barry's book because it shows a crossy tender, shielded by armour plate, transporting auxiliaries encased under protective wire mesh. Now, Professor Ferter earlier on has referred to the auxiliaries and the Black and Tans, so I don't intend to go into their history. But this is the kind of military transport that the auxiliaries would use. I have discovered a crossy tender so-called because they were manufactured by Crossley Motors in Manchester. Some photographs that have reappeared in our calendar, which was produced by our society 2 years ago to commemorate the sack, and it shows the exterior of Pat Connolly's pub and shop and house. And his was the second highest compensation award given in 1922. This is the current premises on that site. And looking across the road, a shot taken of the damage done, considerable damage done to the Durham household. And now, of course, know it's on the site of the present Balbriggan Medical Centre. And I did ask Killian to take a photograph of the date on the top pediment because I mentioned an article by Professor Fitzpatrick, and he actually looked into the history of the compensation claimants. He discovered that the first person to get compensation was John Durham, and possibly because of his social status, and possibly because at that stage his son Jimmy was serving as a TD for the Treaty forces, and he was able to rebuild his premises in 1922. Further up and Drogheda Street, we take this to the exterior of John Landy's thatched pub. He was out of town at the time, and now this is the site owned by the Riley family, the Harvest Inn, and as we can see, they were awarded compensation and rebuilt their building in 1923. Across the road, another contemporary photograph of 3 men, the middle of whom is Joseph McGowan, the owner of the Gladstone Inn. And now the modern building we know as the Milestone, that was taken over by Jimmy Riley in 1977. One or two general photographs of the devastation in Clonard Street, just a general scene looking up Clonard Street from Bridge Street. And an exterior shot of Annie Corcoran's house. House and dairy were damaged. She was awarded considerable compensation. And another view of two further houses, slated houses, burned to the ground, Costello's and O'Brien's houses. And a shot of some of the O'Neill's cottages at the top of Clonard Street, showing the devastation. And presumably some of the people, men, women and children standing there, may have been the previous occupants of the house. An iconic photograph that appears in our calendar, and it depicts a lady and 4 children in the ruins of her house. This particular photograph, very shortly, will be the subject of a presentation by local historian Frank Querity, a member of our society, and for that reason I will not dwell on the photograph any further. This photograph has appeared in many publications, and is the photograph that appeared in Richard Bennett's book in 1959, and it's looking from the hill of Clonard down Clonard Street. And this has been shown over the years in different locations. We never able to identify the man. He's rather nattily attired, suit and coat and bike. But the man with the horse and cart may have been a man called Matthews, whose house still stands on the top of Clonard Street. A shot of the ruined machinery in Deeds Tamper and Company. This caption we took from Michael Barry's book. I think it may be incorrect. We do know that 2 commissions were set up. The British Labour Party set up a committee of inquiry, as did the Americans, and they both looked into the effect throughout Ireland of the damages inflicted by the Crown forces in various locations in Ireland. We'll come back to that commission later on. This is a general shot of a family walking up Chapel Street, obviously having left house and home. You have the father carrying his young child, the son, the mother, son, another daughter, and carrying all their belongings, and people watching them go in hopes that they had somewhere to go to find temporary accommodation. Something I haven't mentioned before, and which doesn't seem to be referred to by local people, but was the fact that the old flour mill, which is still standing on Dublin Street, which had been owned by the families of Walsh and Kenny, was temporarily changed into a hostel for people who had lost their homes, and that bedding and furniture was taken down from the former workhouse at Balloch. An original document given to our archives over the years. Local people are incredibly generous. As May would remember, found a member. We had 2 major exhibitions in 83-94, and people just donated all sorts. This is one item that's quite unique. It's an original. Within days of the sack, a group of local people set up a subscription fund, set her up on a daily basis at the town hall. And the list on the left is the list of people who set up the committee, including the chairperson, treasurers, secretaries. And for a few seconds we'll dwell on their names, because all were leaders, I suppose, of the community. Now, Lewis White was chairman, but he was also the managing director of Smith's Factory. Mr. Moorhead was a local banker. Charles Gallen was the owner of Gallen's Mills on Mill Street. Richard Gorman, we mentioned earlier, was a senior employee of Smith's Factory. Now, there are 4 men mentioned in that as well. Lewis White, Reverend Canon Eugene Byrne, parish priest of Balbriggan, Reverend William Jemison, rector, and Dr. William Fulham, local doctor. And the day after the sack, those 4 men motored to Dublin, and they demanded and got a meeting with Sir John Anderson, the chief civil servant of his time. They expressed their outrage about it happening in Balbriggan. They demanded reparation and assurance that it wouldn't happen again. The 2 curates at the time of Balbriggan were Reverend William Murphy and Reverend Edmund O'Sullivan. And it was Reverend William Murphy who, 6 months earlier, was called to John Costello's house and gave the last rites to the stricken RSC Sergeant Finnerty. At the bottom of the list is a man called William Cochrane, and in his article, Professor Fitzpatrick says he was probably the luckiest person, because 2 years earlier he'd arrived from Ballybor in County Cavan. He represented all 71 claimants and received a legal fee, and as Professor Fitzpatrick said, he made a financial killing. And the bottom name at the bottom was William Bannon, who was then the town clerk. And of course, the organisers felt it incumbent upon themselves to make major contribution as well. Now, we're very indebted to the Glenamaddy Historical Society, in particular a committee member, Pat Keaveney, and to the Burke family, because for quite some time we were looking for further information on the two Burke brothers, and one of our committee members some years ago visited the house in which some of the descendants lived, that was Jerry MacDonald, and also located the burial site in Glenamaddy. But some members of the Burke family to this day are reluctant to talk about it. It was obviously a very traumatic event in their lives. But at my written request, Pat Keaveney decided to approach the family again. And much to my amazement and delight, emailed me these two only known photographs of the two men, young men, in civilian attire, which is how they would have looked on the night of the Sack of Balbriggan. Peter was possibly 33 years of age, and that is his older brother. Discovered that William had served in World War I with the Irish Guards and had been injured on 3 occasions. And Killian recently decided to look up the genealogical records and trace the birth certificates of the 3 brothers, because there was another brother called Michael, and he was also in the RIC, and he was based in Dublin. And we discovered, of course, that Peter was the younger of the brothers, because William was born in 1878, and the date for Peter's birth was given as 1884. And the mother was Winifred Grogan, and it's very difficult to make out the actual townland in which they lived, but Killian reckons it's the townland of Bayona outside Glenamaddy. And I think Jim Hurley, years ago, forwarded some of the following slides to Jerry MacDonald. Years ago, Jim Hurley, who was then a sergeant in the Gardaí based in, I think, in Blarney, became the authority on RSC records and travelled the country lecturing on them. And courtesy of Jim, for the many years we've had details on Peter Burke's RSC record. Born 1884, height 5 feet 10. The areas where he served: promoted sergeant 1915, head constable 1919. Remarkable for a Catholic, I think, of such a young age. And as we see here, the term, of course, used was murdered in Balbriggan, 20 September 1920. This is just a close-up of the death certificate of the man I referred to earlier, William Straw or Jack Straw. It says, unknown, found dead, 21st October, near Bettyville. Medical evidence cannot say how long dead. Gunshot wounds inflicted by persons unknown who committed unlawful murder. Certificate received from Military Court of Inquiry held in King George V Hospital, and the date. Military Court of Inquiry was held into his identity and death. Said he was approximately 30 years of age. And a man gave evidence, and he was the husband of Rosie Donnelly, who was a fish seller in Key Street, with whom William Straw was staying. Apparently he had arrived in Key Street in April of that year, spoke with an English accent. Now Mr. Donnelly said he was a nephew of Rosie Donnelly, but we can't prove that. Now, we're very indebted to Mary English, granddaughter of James Lawless, and of course daughter of Stephen Lawless, who's been particularly helpful and courteous. We visited her house on 2 occasions, and she kindly allowed us to take this image of her grandfather, James Lawless, fine upstanding man. And this is Mary, of course, standing in her garden, holding the portrait. We're indebted to Frank Verity, who presented a framed copy to the Society some years ago. And this is of the O'Dwyer's winning team of Dublin Intermediate League, 1924. The particular relevance, of course, is marked there in the front row is Willie Corcoran. At this stage, he was aged 26, and of course, living a life in Balbriggan. starting for the O'Dwyers. On the top left, in civilian clothes, is Frank Kennedy of the Kennedy family. For years, people call him the Mull Kennedy, and for years he contributed articles on the activities of O'Dwyers and pioneers throughout independent under the pen name Ken O.D. The man on the right in civilian clothes was Philip Curran, County Councillor. This is a photograph of the Knoll Hurling Club 1911. Now, according to Michael Rockstable in 1956, it was formed in 1909. And he was playing for the team 2 years later, and he's featured then again with a sort of cross to establish his identity. And on the back right, a row, third from right, was his brother Sean Rock. A photograph of General Sir Neville Macready, who in 1920 was asked to take control of the army in Ireland and the police force. Despite the fact he was ex-police commissioner in London, he had wanted nothing to do with the RIC in Balbriggan. Privately, he considered them inefficient and incompetent. He thought the role of suppressing the so-called rebellion should be reserved by the military, but the government weren't of that opinion. Now, within a week of the sack, possibly under pressure from the administration, he gave an interview to the Irish Independent, in which he stated that reprisals as such were not official government policy. Later in the article, he attempted to excuse the actions of the forces by saying that, like in reprisals such as towns like Balbriggan, when police found out that a former popular comrade was shot, what could you expect? He was trying to excuse their activities. Now, his autobiography was published in 1924 called Annals of an Active Life. And for the first time I wish to read out just his then description of what happened at Balbriggan as an illustration of how the military could, shall we say, airbrush over activities. And what did he say in war? The first casualty is the truth. Quote, "The burning of a stocking factory at Balbriggan made much stir at the time, being a veritable godsend to the Sinn Féin propaganda bureau. It was a result of a brutal murder of police in the village, men motoring out from the police barracks in Dublin to carry out reprisal. From the accounts in the press, one might have thought that the whole village of Balbriggan was a heap of ashes. One imagined the paper describing it as like a village in the fighting zone in France. He said, I motored to the place a few days after the occurrence and had to look for the factory, a small place down a side lane. One cottage in the village was destroyed, but a person ignorant of what had happened might have motored through the village without being aware that anything unusual had occurred. While the actual perpetrators of the outrage were police, certain inhabitants of the village were by no means free from participation in the burnings. And on the following Sunday, the parish priest told his congregation they only got what they deserved." End of quote. Now, this photograph, Professor Fairletter had mentioned him earlier. There was a clean-out of Dublin Castle administration in early 1920, and 3 top-ranking civil servants were moved to Dublin Castle. Sir John Anderson, the chief civil servant of his time, ably assisted by Alfred or Andy Coe and Mark Sturgis. Andy Coe had a humble background as an ex-policeman, but in effect he was Sir John Anderson's right-hand man, and behind the scenes was dealing with Sinn Féin figures. But Mark Sturgis was a person of a different social background, and several authors have referred to his unexplained diaries, wherein he refers to Balbriggan. He says, what could you expect from a place or a sink like Balbriggan? So, it shows you what certain strata of British society thought of working class towns like Balbriggan. General views of the Chief Secretary, Sir Hamar Greenwood, and his wife, and also Major General Sir Henry Tudor, who was in control of the unarmed DMP, the RIC, and the Black and Tans. A general recruiting poster of the time for members of the ADRSIC, auxiliary division of the police forces. As Professor Fairletter said, some of these men had been promoted officer class in World War I. They received £7 a week. They were heavily armed and heavily motorised and extremely dangerous. Probably one of the first shots taken from Michael Barry's book, probably some of the first band of recruits that came into Dublin to Beggars Bush. black and tans. They became police cadets, and there weren't enough uniforms to go around, so initially they were dressed in military khaki and police green, black belts and assorted caps, and hence they attracted the name the black and tans. A recruiting poster then showing the uniforms as such. So second from the left, the black and tans in terms of uniforms then were almost indistinguishable from the RIC, but the auxiliaries who were given the immediate rank of sergeant with their Balmoral bonnets, puttees, bandoliers, low-slung holsters were a different kettle of fish. And an illustration of such a temporary cadet with Balmoral beret. Thank you. Now, Balbriggan is considered one of the two most notorious reprisals during the War of Independence. Chronologically, it was the first because it preceded the sacking of, or the burning of Cork. The main reason is because when a day of this, journalists came down by road and rail from Dublin, and at that time, in 1920, a considerable number of British, French, American and Irish journalists were based in Dublin. And Desmond Fitzgerald, who was the head of Sinn Féin propaganda, was making his business to feed them with the information. He was making sure that these journalists were given access in the Shelbourne Hotel and interviewing senior figures. They all descended around Balbriggan and reported what they saw within days in great detail, and their photographers. So within days, the British administration were coming under pressure because all the British newspapers at the time were carrying similar articles. Hugh Martin, considered a John Simpson of his time, was based in Dublin. He wrote for the Daily News, a mass circulation daily. No less a paper than the Westminster Gazette was the first to refer to the sack, and they said Balbriggan sacked. Now, these are an example of that. We have the Daily Graphic, a tabloid of its time, and September the 23rd, and it features photographs we've already seen, but this is taken in the first week of September 1920, and probably the best photograph we have of John Gibbons. Quite unique photograph, and it actually, at the funerals of Seamus Lawes and Sean Gibbons, past the police barracks en route to Balscadden Cemetery, RIC members come out and salute, so we could see 6 or 7 personnel saluting the cortege as it drives by. And I wonder, is that quite unique? I can't imagine it was common practice for members of the Crown Forces to salute ex-members of the volunteers, but because, of course, that these men were based locally, probably would have known James Lawless particularly and John Gibbons personally. Perhaps they were coming under pressure immediately because the Crown Forces knew the damage that it had inflicted, etc. Now, as an example of how widely the event was covered, two months later, and this is taken from the Acts of the Irish Revolution, this colour illustration appeared in a supplement in an Italian magazine or journal called La Tribuna. And Killian had the Italian text translated, and it reads on the bottom of the drawing or illustration, "Terror in Ireland, the population of the Irish town of Balbriggan leave their homes, carrying the furniture and household goods that they could salvage after the sacking by the English troops." Now, one such journalist was a man called Joseph Kessel, and we're indebted to Pauline O'Hare, past president of the Historical Society. One year while sojourning in France, completely by accident, she came across a journal published in French in 1956 by this man. Because her French is brilliant, she read it. At my request, she, a year ago, forwarded it to me and translated it. And when I read it, I couldn't believe it. It's a very dramatic and a journalistic account of exactly what that man experienced the next morning. Now, we have never actually transposed it or published it yet in English. For the purpose of this translation, or this presentation, for a few moments, I just want to give you a flavour of his article. He said that the next morning he got a phone call from Desmond Fitzgerald, who said, "Get down to Balbriggan, something has happened." He said, "Where's Balbriggan?" The small little place 20 miles from Dublin. Jumped into a taxi. Describes the complexion and countenance of the taxi driver. He found the journey interminable. When he came into Balbriggan, he could understand what the excitement was about. People were in a state of terror. Women and children wandering about in a state of distress. The taxi driver disappears. And as Salle approaches people, they withdraw. And he says, I was introduced to a young curate called Byrne. We know now he was, of course, Canon Byrne, the parish priest, who tells him in great detail how peaceable and how prosperous the town had been until yesterday. Then, of course, a little bit Joseph Kessel himself. He served as an aviator in World War I and survived. After World War I, he became a troubleshooting journalist, a famous journalist of his time. And he and two other contemporaries, Jean Barreau and Simon Terry, were in Dublin at the time. He describes the scenes of terror and devastation, compares scenes he'd seen in Flanders. And towards the end of his account, he says, I viewed the mutilated remains of one of the men. And he concludes with a conversation with Canon Byrne. And this man had a somewhat incredible life, because after his journalistic career, he actually served as a pilot with the Free French Army with 342 Squadron in England and survived that. And after the war, he became a famous journalist and author. We're just going to look briefly at some news cuttings, particularly taken from the Drogheda Independent over the years, of how the Sack was celebrated. And of course, in 1941 is the 21st anniversary. Here we have photographs of the local LDF, Land Defence Forces, and the Boy Scouts, marching up George's Square towards the church, saluting the people on the podium, one of whom was Canon Hickey at the time, and I believe also a TD called Fogarty was present. In 1970, on the 50th anniversary, of course, there was a special mass and ceremony held at Balbriggan Cemetery, where James Lawless and John Gibbons were interred. And we can see in the bottom left, Willie Corcoran laying a wreath in front of the memorial, members of the army, about to fire a volley, as such. This photograph recently occurred to my sister Margaret Tusky, who in 1970, with her little pram carrying her two young children, walked out Flemington Lane and took this photograph of the Mass, which for some reason wasn't held at a nearby St. Mary's Church, but was held within this portal, which was actually built by my grandfather Jimmy Walsh, and for many years hung on hooks outside the courthouse on the square, and it was used during annual Corpus Christi processions, and obviously it was taken on a lorry out to Balscadden and put on top of a trailer. And I'd say the reason they didn't use the church was they were expecting a very large number of people from Balscadden and Balbriggan to come out. We can actually identify the four clergy in question, and the parish priest was Father Tonge, and the curates were Fathers Collier, Fingleton and Murphy. And this is a recent photograph I obtained, courtesy of Joe Curtis. And Joe Curtis and his great buddy Jack Benton were here on the occasion in 1970 to take photographs, of which this was one. And since Jack Benton died, Joe has been the custodian of Jack's extensive collection of photographs. And obviously there had been Mass and a march down after the Mass, and obviously the road could be cleared in those days because it's blocked with local townspeople. So we have Jerry McGowan, local solicitor and son of Joseph McGowan, about to lay a wreath at the plaque. On the left is Willie Corcoran, then age 72, and the right is Louis Durham, for many years town commissioner and the son of John Durham. And we can say the head is behind Jerry McGowan of Jack Gaynor, who, as you know, in 1955 took credit for being the assailant of Sergeant Finnerty, and he was the first company captain of the Volunteers. Paddy Burke in the back was a then TD, and on the right is Frank Kennedy standing there. On to the left, we have various members of the Lawless family, including the eldest son Brian, who's passed away, and Mary and Stephanie are in that as well, and Mary's mother, and also Una. In the background is my father, Fintan Walsh, who at the age of 91 is still hale and hearty, and he was aged 41 then at the time. In 1984, the Drogheda Independent produced a splendid centenary issue of their newspaper, and they reissued reportage over a 100 years period. But looking at for us, I remember buying 2 copies in Kitty White's shop, for £1 each. And lucky enough for us, when I opened it, they devoted 2 pages of their original reportage. And the text is very, very detailed for a reporter of his time. And over the years at Balbriggan Library, when Leaving Cert students approached me if they were doing a project in Sack of Balbriggan, I kept copies in my little locker in the office and just copied them for them. And said, look, if you study those, you'll have more than enough information, because at that stage the students had to memorize the material for their projects. 1995, and we have further coverage. A girl called Ciara Ryan from the Drogheda come up to me in the library, gave her some background information, and for the first time I was in possession of the photograph in the top left-hand side that was given to me by Bill Keeling, with the permission of his brother Joe, and it showed the unveiling of the Memorial in 1941 in Balscaddon. And for the first time I actually knew the date of the placement of the plaque, because they both occurred in 1941. And here we have down here an enlarged photograph of some members of the old IRA in Balscaddon about to unveil the plaque. Stephen Lawless himself here, and Tree Town Commissioner standing here as well beside the plaque in Bridge Street. And further photographs then from the same paper. Members of the Lawless family again, and inset on the left-hand side was the then principal of Balscaddon National School, Owen Collum. And of course then in 1999, when the Fingal were producing a kind of a millennium look back, looking back I suppose for 100 years, they identified Sack of Balbriggan as the most historic and the most memorable. Now I refer to the American Commission that came in to Ireland. Now they came to Ireland between the 12th of February 1921 and 31st of March. And this photograph appears in a page in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution. And the caption says they visited 95 locations. But the first locations were in mid-February, Skerries, Balbriggan and Crow Park. And he identified the 2 gentlemen on the front as Clement J. France, a Seattle-based lawyer, and John McCoy, and 6 members of the commission behind them. And at the back were local members of the community. And I think they're the same men who were featured in the earlier photograph in Deeds Hosiery. Now we know eventually that they produced the reports, and that of all the monies they raised, they settled on the sum of £4,000 for the town of Balbriggan for what they called the encouragement of industrial initiatives. Here's a photograph that appears in the calendar, and that was the basis of the illustration in that tribune. 3 local women, 2 at prams, carrying all their possessions and heading up Clonard Street. 2 pages from the article by Professor David Fitzpatrick, where he itemised what local people were awarded, their social standing from 1911 census, and their occupation. And it's in order of compensation. And I think it's a remarkable document. So he tells us that in all, £83,727 was awarded. Half of that sum was awarded to Deeds Temple and Sons, the owners of the factory. Patrick Connolly, £7,500. Joseph McGowan, £6,700. John Durham, £6,000, etc. And we actually see that Anne Corcoran did receive £2,225, and she was a dairy keeper. So the British Treasury in all, over a period of 4 or 5 years, paid out £7 million to people who suffered at the hands of the Crown forces. And Killian took these photographs of Murray Quest just to show that people of Balbriggan have a memory. Durham Park was built in the 50s, and we take it to have been named in honour of Jimmy Durham, or James Durham, because unfortunately we learned that he did eventually serve as a TD for 2 separate parties, and yet he had a very early tragic end. Because in 1924, aged 27, while socialising with Michael O'Rourke, who was then in charge of Spicer's Bakery, he fell down the stairs and died. And Durham Park was named after him, and perhaps after his father as well. And Gibbons Terrace and Lawless Terrace were built in the mid-1930s to commemorate both men. And in fact, my father was reared at number 1 Gibbons Terrace for many years. People were indebted to local doctor, Dr. William Fulham. In the claims for compensation, his house was not damaged, only claimed compensation for damaged clothing. And obviously he was up all night ministering to people. And he was one of the group of 4 people who were in Dublin the next day seeing Sir John Anderson. And now we're looking at some memorials to finish our presentation. Canon Byrne died 4 years later, in 1924. He was a native of Anamo in County Wicklow, and he, I suppose, he was parish priest during the events of April of 1920 and also 1920. And he was the man in a different capacity that commissioned the 2 famous stained glass windows at Balbriggan from the Harry Clark studio as such. Now, Killian travelled out to Stamullen and photographed the memorial of Dr. Fulham, in loving memory of William F. Fulham, MD, 31st December 1934, and his wife Susan, who died 31st July 1929. Some years later, his daughter Phyllis Penny, donated a large inscribed memorial address to Dr. Fulham for members of the Irish National Foresters. We had it displayed for several years and is now a part of our archives in Argyll Castle. It's particularly difficult to read, but this is actually the wording on the stone of Peter Burke and the family plot in Donaghmady, and Killian was very, very kind and included a caption: "Oh Jesus, have mercy on the soul of my dear brother Peter Burke, District Inspector RIC of Baluna, Townland, who died September 20th, 1920, aged 33 years, and the soul of my dear mother Winifred Burke." What I can't quite understand is that on his police record and his birth certificate, his date of birth is given as 1884, which means he should have been 36 years of age in 1920, and yet according to his family he's aged 33. That's something to be gone into later on. And here in Balbriggan at St. Peter and Paul's Cemetery, we have the memorial of William Corcoran, and he died in 1989, and it says Balbriggan Company 1st Battalion, Fingal Brigade, Old IRA. And in Swords we have the memorial of Michael Rock. Now Michael Rock, just before the War of Independence ended, he almost bore a charmed life, but not quite. On the 2nd of July 1921, while cycling a place called Spring Hill, out to a flying column in Old Town, 2 cross-lieutenants passed him, and he was shot twice, in the arm and in the hip, severely injured, carried to the Coast Guard station in Balbriggan, where the Black and Tans were ensconced, tended to by Dr. Fulham, who insisted on accompanying him to the military hospital in Grange-Gorman, where he was operated upon. He says in his statement he was interrogated by intelligence, threatened with death on several occasions when hanging, but he was saved by the truth of the 11th of July. He was later released in Christmas of that year and took no further part in the Irish Civil War. And he formed an undertaker business in Swords, and his grandson Michael Rocks continued the business to this day. So Michael Rocks survived until 1969, and he was aged 83. We have no photographs of Jimmy Durham, Michael James Durham, but I'm indebted to Anne Heaney from Dublin Street. Years ago, she presented me with an album of photographs and news cuttings belonging to her parents going back to the turn of the century. And these are 3 quite remarkable photographs of the funeral of Jimmy Durham, and his body's been taken out and coffin from the Pro Cathedral. Possibly some of the men in the photograph are local men, possibly family members, possibly members of local volunteers. And the 3 men on the top right were told that the man on the left was John Durham himself, Jimmy Durham's father. And I just think, I don't like speculating, but the man on the right to me looks remarkably like a young Seamus Sean Lamass. John Durham and his wife Margaret moved to Skerries, and it's on Home Patrick Skerries that you'll find the very brief and concise memorial to Michael James Durham, died 20th of November 1923, aged 27 years. Very brief and succinct. And now we move out to Balscadden Cemetery, and this was the memorial that was unveiled in September 1941, sacred to the memory of Seamus Lawless and Sean Gibbons, who were brutally done to death by British forces while under custody occasion of the Sack of Balbriggan, 20th September 1920. And then, faithful and uncompromising sons of Ireland, their names shall live in the grateful memory of the people. Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriotic men and women spring living nations pierce. And we finish with this final slide, and as we now know, this was erected in 1941. A local committee was formed, including Stephen Lawless and fellow town commissioners, county councillors and sympathetic local people. A fund of money was raised as such. And suitable tribute, and I think, to the fallen. And that concludes our presentation. Thank you.